right, in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and get started. Toki ya yanadeo, miyan ke kansan, mi wile pana e Sona pi Toki Pona. Hey everyone, I'm Greg Den 3, and today I want to tell you about Toki Pona. Today we're going to talk about preverbs, and I'll quickly note there's a funny terminology thing going on with preverbs. It's most common to call them preverbs, but they also get called auxiliary verbs, and my own fault, they sometimes get called pre-predicates. Preverbs is most common, so it's fine to stick to that. There are lots of different ways to think about them, though. But the critical thing is that, grammar-wise, they go after li, or wherever li belongs in a sentence, and they go before the actual verb. And that's really where most of the name comes from. They are preverbs. So with that said, we're going to get into the lesson itself. Pen, here we go. So preverbs are kind of funny because there's a limited set of them, unlike all the rest of the content words in Toki Pona that can go basically anywhere. The only other category that's like that is the prepositions, where there are 5 of those, and there are basically 7 preverbs. So I'll quickly note they are wile, W-I-L-E, that is to want or need. Ken, K-E-N, and this is talking about your ability or permission to do something. Kama, K-A-M-A. Kama talks about something becoming true or something changing. You can imagine like the process of learning as a kama, where the thing that arrives per se is knowledge. And so learning is often referred to as kama Sona, and in a sentence we might say mi kama Sona. And I spend the extra time on the example because that one can be a little weird to wrap your head around. Next, we have awen, A-W-E-N. Awen is almost like the opposite of kama, in that where kama talks about something changing, awen talks about it staying the same. Something is continuing to be true. Something remains. Next, we have Sona, S-O-N-A, where Sona, the content word, has to do with knowledge and understanding. Sona as a preverb has to do with being skilled in something. It has a lot of overlap with ken in that regard, but it is more specific and useful on its own. Then the last two are funny. We have alasa, A-L-A-S-A, and alasa has to do with trying, attempting something. And then there is lukin, L-U-K-I-N, and lukin also has to do with trying or attempting to do something. The reason for this is kind of complicated, but we can just treat them both as meaning the same thing as a preverb. So, this is all of the preverbs in Toki Pona. There are a couple of others out there that are fairly rare use. You'll probably see them around, but this lesson is not going to focus on them, and for completeness, I'll note that they are all either kind of weird or easily restated in terms of one of these preverbs. So these are by far the most common of all the preverbs out there. So let me clear that, and we will go on to examples of each of these. First, there is the wile preverb. If I say something simple like mi wile pali, normally a sentence like this would be formed as mi pali. that is, I work, or I create, or I do something. The wile here before the verb, or I suppose it looks like it's in the verb, but it is before the verb in this sense, as a preverb, it means that instead of you doing the something or creating the something, you are wanting to do that something or wanting to create that something. Or it could be a need as well. It's fairly common to get this mixed up with with the object marker, so I'll quickly go over the difference there. Let's say we have an example like mi wile moku versus mi wile moku. At a glance, the difference in meaning between these two is pretty small, and I would say that's true even though the grammar is different. The second of these, mi wile moku, talks about food. That is, it talks about a distinct thing that you are acting on. So mi wile is to want or need, and then tells you you're talking about a discrete other thing, an object, and moku then must be food. The distinction here is that mi wile moku keeps moku in the verb. In other words, it's more reasonable to interpret as an action. In other words, mi wile moku, wile being a preverb here, is I want to eat, an action. And then mi wile moku, that's I want food, an object. This is the critical difference between preverbs living in the verb and objects not living in the verb. They give the listener more of a hint as to how to interpret this last object here. In the former, moku is in the verb, more likely to be eat. In the latter, moku is in the object, more likely to be food. And this applies all over the place. Although I will quickly note, the main reason I'm going over this is because it's just very common to mix up these two types of sentences, especially with how similar this particular example is. But suffice to say, this is a totally different piece of grammar, and actually has basically no relationship to the preverb. The object is a totally separate thing. And hopefully I'll get that idea across through the course of this lesson. So, that's the wile preverb. Again, it is to want or need here at the start of the verb. And so this translation, mi wile moku, I want to eat. Clearing that, we're going to continue on to ken. So let's say Sina, ken, Pona, let's say moku, tawa, soeli. Sina, ken, Pona, moku, tawa, soeli. And I'd like you to keep an eye on my inflection there because I'm helping you mark out where different parts of speech begin and end. Sina is our subject, ken Pona is the verb, moku is the object, and tawa soeli, that's a preposition. If that's unfamiliar to you, I'll just make sure to translate this as we go. So what's the deal with ken here? Well, as I noted, it is all together in this part of speech we call the verb, but ken, like any preverb, it is telling us something that we have to know about the verb. It is changing the character of the verb. Just like wile before, but ken in particular, again, has to do with permission or your ability to do something. So let's go over this sentence in full. Sina is you, a second person pronoun. Ken is ability or permission. Pona is to give, to emit. Object marker. Moku, Remember before how moku being in the object implies more strongly that it is a thing, in this case food, tawa, preposition, and then soeli, a critter. Specifically, tawa preposition is to or for, so that being a part of speech unto itself, this whole sentence translates as you may, can, are able to give food to the dog, for example. And the critical thing is, where with like a modifier, we could imagine getting rid of the word and then still be able to interpret the sentence. With a preverb, we actually cannot do that. The preverb is changing the meaning of the sentence. You can still, as an exercise, imagine not having it. You'll get a fairly similar sentence, but it does mean a new thing. For example, if I say, Sina pana e moku tawa soeli, that would actually be, you give the dog food, or you give food to the dog. And so, that's ken, and that's how preverbs interact with the sentence. They really do change it, and that's a very important idea. You can't just get rid of these. And now I'll quickly note, you might be wondering, how can you tell apart a preverb from the rest of the sentence? I have to say, unfortunately, the answer is experience. You really just have to get a sense for what words can fit up here and when they get used one way versus another. But I can give you some tips. The first is, generally, if these words are very first in the verb, like directly after li or where li would go, so after me or sina is valid, as is after o, that is almost always a preverb in that context. But if the very next word is e rather than another verb, well, then that wouldn't be a preverb because there's nothing for it to be pre of. Remember the example I gave of mi, wile, e, moku? Wile here isn't a preverb, and that is because it is immediately followed by e. It's not pre of any verb, so it's just the verb itself. So those are your two tips on how to find preverbs in a sentence. All right, I've spent a lot of time on those examples, so we're going to go through the others fairly quickly. But the goal is to get an idea of how they work. So, clearing that. Let's say we now have Pona, li, kama, Sona, e, ni. Ona, li, kama, Sona, e, ni. Ona is our third person pronoun, refers to he, she, they, it. Li marks a verb. Kama, that's our preverb for this example. Sona is knowledge or understanding. E marks an object, and ni is this or that. So we're referring to some other thing to know. Kama, as I noted, refers to things changing, something becoming the case. So, or I guess in the context of the content word kama, it's a bit like something arriving, right? So, ona, li, kama, sona, ignoring the object for now, that would be they are becoming learned, or they are acquiring information. The practice of gaining information, basically. Or translated more aptly in English, they are learning, right? The object then is just something for this verb to apply to. It's not just learning all on its own, but it's learning some specific thing. E ni. So, ona, li, kama, sona, e ni, they learned this. And it doesn't really matter what this is, just something in particular. But, of course, I've given the kama sona example already, so let's try another one. Mi, kama, wile, lape. So this example works in both kama and wile. It uses two preverbs rather than just one. Conveniently, they just go in the order you read them from left to right, and that makes it pretty straightforward to understand them. Kama is again something changing, something becoming the case. Wile is to want or need, and then lape is to rest, relax, or sleep. And so, kama wile is to become wanting. Kama wile lape is to become wanting to rest or sleep. And so altogether, mi kama wile lape, that is, I just wanted to go to sleep. Just as in, just now that became the case. Man, I could think of a better translation for that. It's a little awkward to translate into English, I suppose. The idea is you just now wanted... Say again? Sure, I'm getting sleepy. I just now wanted to go to sleep. Well, I just now became wanting to go to sleep. Yeah, I'm getting sleepy is a good way to get at that. Thank you. So summarizing that, kama is about something changing and therefore becoming the case. So it could be a continuous thing. For example, to go quickly, kama suli is often used to refer to something growing. Kama, if I said without wile here, mi kama lape, that is, I went to sleep. That's it for kama. So continuing on, if I clear that, let's say we have sina, awen, kute. Let's say toki, mi. Sina, awen, kute, toki, mi. So where kama is something changing, something becoming the case, awen is something remaining, something still being true. And so if I say sina, awen, kute, that would be you are still listening. It's not that something changed, it's that you were listening before and you're still listening now. Sina, awen, kute, and then we mark an object, toki, mi. Toki is speech, communication, thought, any sort of communication for that matter. Toki, mi, my communication, my speaking. So altogether, sina, awen, kute, toki, mi. That is, you are still listening to my speech. And that's you, right now. You are doing that. Clearing that. All right. Next, we have Sona. So, Sona is a funny one because unlike the rest of the preverbs, it is much more often used in ways that are not preverbs. It is most often used as a content word because it turns out knowing things and talking about what you know is a lot more common than specifically talking about what you're skilled in. But Sona preverb is still around and still very, very useful. So let's look at what it would do in a sentence. Yan mute li Sona pali ilo. Yan mute li Sona pali ilo. So the subject yan mute. Yan is a person or people. Mute is a lot, so we're talking about a lot of people. Li marks the verb. Sona is our preverb. And that, again, talks about being skilled in something. Pali is to work or create, and ilo is a tool, something you can use for some purpose. So, yan mute li sona pali ilo. Well, we know that sona is the preverb, so we're talking about some kind of skill. Pali being work or create, meaning this is some process of work, something you may create or do. And then ilo, really this could be any type of ilo, but I think most commonly in this community, we talk about computers, right? We're just always talking about computers. We're here on computers right now. And so, sona pali ilo, as our verb, that's something like are skilled in working on computers. And you may be wondering, why isn't there an e here? Like, that would still have sona as a preverb, right? Well, ilo is here modifying pali because we're not talking about making computers. We're talking about the skill of working with computers. And that distinction is made by having or not having an object. Remember the example with moku from before, where when it was in the verb, when it was between li and e, it meant to eat, and then when we put it after e, it meant food? The same applies here. It's just that the idea we're talking about is a little more abstract. Sona pali ilo is the skill of working with a computer. But if ilo were an object, that is, if we said yan mute li sona pali e ilo, that would be many people know how to create. The skill is then just creating e ilo tools or computers. Tools as a distinct thing from the verb. So that's sona. Again, this translation is yan mute, many people, li sona pali ilo. They know how to work with computers. They are skilled at computer working. I think it's actually worth doing another example with sona because, again, it's a little bit of a weird one to wrap your head around. So, let's go ahead and do that. Let's say Akisi li sona alasa e pipi. Oh, there we go. Akisi li sona alasa e pipi. So, akisi is a reptile or amphibian. Li sona alasa. Again, sona is our preverb, so that's to be skilled in. Alasa is to search or hunt. E is marking an object, so we have some distinct thing in the sentence. And that distinct thing is pipi, a bug, tiny creepy crawly critter. And so, altogether, this is, let's say, a snake is skilled in hunting bugs. Do snakes eat bugs? I actually don't know. Probably so, right? They do. Okay, cool. Snakes do eat bugs. So the snake is skilled in hunting for bugs. And that's pretty much it for sona preverb. The idea is, again, it talks about being skilled in something. I'll reiterate my warning that it is not as common as sona content word. That is sona to talk about knowledge or understanding. And for that matter, there are a fair number of people who do not even use sona preverb and just use sona as a content word to talk about what they are skilled in. Or, as I noted before, they may use ken as well. Both of these are valid approaches. I personally really like Sona preverb and like what it does for Toki Pona, but, find your own way. All right, last one. And by last one, I mean last two, because again, arasa and lukin mean the same thing as preverbs. So let's say mi, alasa, pona, e, tomo. And we can see the exact same thing with mi, lukin, pona, e, tomo. Again, exact same meaning. So here at the start, mi, we're talking about ourselves, so I. Alasa, again, that is to try, to attempt to. And you can imagine that meaning deriving from hunting or searching pretty reasonably. So to try to, pona is here in the verb. So this is like applying goodness, because we have e directly after. Applying goodness is like improving, fixing, healing, repairing. So, mi alasa pona e tomo, I try to, mi alasa, I try to, pona, repair or fix, e tomo, the building or the home. And again, lukin as a preverb has the same meaning. I will quickly note that, especially recently, alasa has become more common than lukin preverb. But again, they mean the same thing. Basically, everyone will understand both of them either way. All right, so that's actually it for all of the different preverbs, and we have perhaps 5 minutes left, but I would like to go over one more important topic, which is what happens if you use ala with a preverb? Let me grab an example out of my notes. Okay. And we'll kind of mix some ideas together here. So, ona, li, ken, ala, awen, pali. And actually, we'll bring back a prior example. Ona, li, kama, wile, lape. So, when you use ala in the preverb, it still obeys that rule I described before, where you're basically just rating them in the order they appear, in this case from left to right. The difference is, ala negates the prior one. When I say it negates it, that means that thing is not the case, of course. So, ona li ken ala. Well, ken talks about the ability or permission of something, so ken ala is talking about the lack of that ability or permission. If we look at just ona li ken ala as though the sentence ended there, that would be they are unable. They don't have that ability. But the whole sentence is ona li ken ala awen pali. So altogether, well, looking at awen, that is to continue, and pali is, of course, work or create. Pali is just very easy to make examples of this. That's why it comes up so much. So, ona li ken ala awen pali. Well, awen, we're continuing, pali to work. Ken ala awen pali. They are unable to continue to work. So they were working before, and they are no longer even able to continue. As a matter of fact, we could say right after this sentence, ona li awen ala pali, or also similarly, Ona li kama pali ala. And I'll admit I'm throwing on a lot here at the end of the lesson, but let me quickly go over these. So, ona li kama ala, ona li ken ala awen pali, they are unable to continue working. Direct consequence of that, ona li awen ala pali, where awen is to continue, awen ala is to not continue. So they were working before, and now they're not. This other sentence I made an example of, this is basically the same information, but expressed with comma instead of with awen ala. Let me explain. Ona li kama, to become, pali ala. Here, ala is actually working on the verb rather than the preverb, so this is not working. Ona li kama pali ala, they have become not working. Again, basically the same information as this prior sentence, ona li awen ala pali. As is the case with the rest of Toki Pona, it's very, very easy to find multiple ways to express the same or at least similar ideas. Thus, this restatement here. All right, so that's basically it for negating preverbs. Ala just immediately says the previous one is not the case. It's not, it's just not on that. It's negating that. Ona li awen ala pali, they are not continuing to work. Ona li kama pali ala, they become not working, or they stopped working. And then I brought back this example because it actually fits very nicely into this example. Ona li kama wile lape. So we might ask ourselves, why did they become unable to continue working? Why did that happen? Ona li kama wile lape. They want to sleep instead. All right, that's it for this lesson. I'll give it like 2 minutes for questions. Question from Yansaki. So the question was, in the comma examples, I almost always translate it as the past tense. Is it always the past tense? The answer is no. That's kind of a consequence of having a short amount of time and thinking about these on the fly. But no, it does not have to be in the past tense. If I say ona li kama pali, that could mean they will work, and that could be in the future. There's no problem with that. Any more questions? Yeah. Can wile also mean I will? No. No, wile cannot mean I will. It means I want or need. When you want to refer to I will, that's a matter of the tense, the time at which something takes place. So that information can be stored elsewhere in the sentence. Like I could use a la phrase and say tempo kama la, and then whatever I wanted to say. That is tempo, time, comma, arriving, la, context for the remainder of the sentence. And then that would clarify that it's a will, a future thing. But wile doesn't mean I will do something. It just refers to want or need. Yes, will, like the future tense, does depend on the context very often, yes. Any more questions? Okay, so why are looking and alasa the preverbs for trying? The short version is, in English, we have this statement like, I'm looking to do this, which basically means I'm trying to do something, right? That's where most people believe the original looking preverb came from. As for alasa, that one came later. And it was because a lot of people in like, I think 2020 and 2021, I had to double check that, but around that era, looked at looking and said, well, wait, this is almost like a calque of English. Like it's adapting a turn of phrase in English directly into Toki Pona. But Toki Pona has a word, alasa, that kind of fits closer to trying on its own. That is to search or hunt for. That being said, there are lots of possible metaphors you could have used. Like a totally different version of Toki Pona could have existed in a parallel universe, right? Different metaphors could have been used to make up the bulk of the language. So any word could have been used. It's just that these ones happen to be the ones we actually ended up using in this world. Looking is in Toki Pona, the language of good. I don't remember if alasa is. I don't think it is. Rather, the content word is in there, but it's not listed as a preverb, unlike looking. So alasa has come from community usage. Looking has come from Sonia, basically. I think that one also a little bit came from community usage, but that's before my time by quite a bit. All right, one last question. No questions? Oh. Okay, so the question is, I mentioned there were exactly 7 preverbs, and I mentioned that they were not necessarily the only ones. I don't particularly like going into the remainder, in part because they're very rare on their own, and talking about them kind of encourages their use to an extent. But sure, I'll go ahead and list the others. Primarily, there are open and pini. That is something beginning, starting to literally open something. And then there is pini to end, stop, or block something. The thing is, both of those can be restated with kama, awen, ala, and that was, if you note the subtext, a little bit the purpose of my last example. To kind of preempt the idea of those 2 preverbs. You can use them if you want, and I think they are largely understandable, but I will still quibble and note they're rare and not really recommended. But yeah, that's the story with those 2. There are, I will say, a very rare, very experimental others. I personally have never encountered them in a way that they are understandable, and so I will not list them here. But if you go hunting, you could probably find some discussion on the various communities. All right, so that was the last question. So thank you all so much for listening. I had to turn off my recording, but I hope you learned something cool.